So, like I said, in order to talk about resumes, we must also talk about the resume's stricter, more detail-oriented friend, the application. So I've gotten questions from job seekers throughout my career asking, why on earth do I need to submit an application and a resume when the application asks for my contact information and my work history and my skills and my education? And then I submit a resume with my contact information and my work history and my skills and my education. Why the repetition? Is this just them being mean? What's going on? The reason that many employers do that is that often the application and the resume have different jobs to do. So the application would be a legal document that's created by the employer. It's also a screening document in many cases. And the resume is a marketing tool. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this workshop of a resume as a marketing tool for you. So very briefly, we can talk through applications, some basics. If you happen to attend last week's workshop, you would have gotten a little bit more in-depth information about kind of the whole application process and what to keep in mind. So we'll just be skimming the surface today. So first, a very good rule of thumb is to read the instructions for the application and as much of it as you can at the beginning. That's not always going to be possible with an online application because sometimes you have to complete a page before you can see the next one, but it can help to look ahead as far as you can and make sure you give yourself plenty of time. Because there are some applications that just want your most recent position, and that's pretty much it. Some of them want your last 10 years of employment and unemployment with every single month accounted for, and then also your last several years of address history. It just really depends on the field that you're in and the type of position you're applying for. Some of them have an assessment that takes a half hour. And so you want to allow yourself time and don't do it when you know you have to be somewhere in a half hour because you are never going to know how long that application will be. Also, you want to make sure that you have time to target your resume and to get a cover letter ready, but we will be coming back to that. Another good thing to keep in mind for applications is to fill out everything if you can. If something does not apply to you, I would still encourage you, if you can, to type in NA or not applicable. That way the employer knows that you saw it and that it doesn't apply, rather than that you missed it or skipped it or what have you. So ideally, try not to leave anything blank. Another good tip, and a general good tip, I would say, is to read the small print. You may notice if you're filling out a lot of applications that most of them, usually at the very end of that application, will have a big old block of text. And that big block of text just screams, I am very boring. Please skip me. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Do not listen to that voice. I do recommend taking a look at that small print. Often you will be signing after that, whether that is in ink or with an electronic signature. And anyone who has worked with contracts or legal documents would probably know it's a good idea to know what you're signing your name to. Often it will be confirming that everything you've put in the application is true and accurate. And you may be also just agreeing to some pieces of how that application process works. So make sure that you read through it. And finally, and I would say that this last tip will save you the most headaches when you're filling out a lot of applications. Keep good records. This is life-changing if you haven't been doing it. Because goodness knows, most employers, if they have an online application, they're going to have you make an account and they're going to have you make a username and a password and maybe a security question and maybe a PIN and who knows what else. And if you are actively filling out a lot of applications per day, per week, etc., it's very easy for some of them to kind of blend together in your mind. It's not reasonable to ask you to keep all of that information straight in your mind. So I would recommend keeping a good record. Keep track of that on this date, I applied with this employer for this position, and maybe any additional details about it. If there's a job ID that you would often find on the job description, include that so you can refer to it. And then what was the username and password and PIN or secret question and answer or whatever else you had to make for that account. That way you will have access to that information and it can help you keep track of when you've contacted employers, can help you get a good idea of when to follow up if needed, and just not have to rack your brain and click forgot password 1,000 times a day. So keeping good records can be a game changer when you're applying for a lot of positions. So that is the very quick dipping the toe in on applications. And I would encourage you, if you have further questions about applications, to set up an appointment with your closest career force office. We're happy to chat through any questions that you might have about them. But let's get to the main event here and let's talk about resumes. So, like I said, we'll be covering a lot of ground today. My hope is that by the time you come out of this workshop at the end, then you will feel confident in understanding key resume basics, the basic sections of the resume, understanding the importance of targeting the resume and some ways to do that, knowing what formats are out there, or at least some of the main ones, and what you can do to make sure you're using the best format for you. And then knowing what an accomplishment statement is and how you can use them on your resume to really show what makes you unique and make sure that you stand out for the work that you have done and your skills. So finally, at the end, like I said, we'll briefly talk about the cover letter, is like what is the importance of it, what basic content is good to include. So regarding resumes, I would imagine a lot of you have perhaps heard some advice about resumes before. And if you've gotten multiple perspectives on advice, you may have noticed that if you talk to 5 people about resumes, you might get 10 opinions about what makes a good one. And that's because there's no exact formula to it. If there were, then everyone would have a perfect resume all the time. And that is just not going to be the case, because a resume, what works well for one person, can really not highlight the best qualities and best skills of someone else. So that's a good thing to keep in mind whenever you're going through any kind of resume advice, including what's in this workshop. These are best practices that we have learned from employers. And so that's why this workshop is not going to say, here is what you need to do. Here's exactly how your resume needs to look. But rather, we'll be giving general guidelines and best practices for this might work well for you if you're in this situation. This might work well in this situation. This is generally a good idea from what we've heard from employers. So the important thing is that you are comfortable with your resume and you feel it represents you well as a candidate, as an applicant, as a professional. So as you continue to read and research about resumes, you're likely to find conflicting advice out there, and it can be very discouraging, especially if you're really looking for some help with the resume. Then it can be very tempting to just throw your hands up and say, well, is it 1 page or 2? What is the truth? So the answer can be both, depending on your situation and the type of work you're applying for. So when you do see conflicting advice or advice that goes against something you've learned before, I'd encourage you to think about the context. Is this advice directed to a job seeker of a specific industry or with a certain background? And then just ask, is this what's right for me and my situation? Because ultimately, the only test for whether your resume is doing its job is if you are getting interviews for positions you are interested in. If you're getting interviews, but they are all for positions you are overqualified for or underqualified for, your resume is not doing its job to the best of its ability. If you're not getting interviews at all, then it's definitely not doing its job. It's doing its job when you get interviews for the positions you are interested in. So, after saying all that about how resumes can be many different things, are there some best practices in general for resumes? There are. So, we'll talk through these with an acronym because we love acronyms here. So, to start with, what generally you want your resume to be is a review of your qualifications for a specific position or occupation or industry. And the reason that I specify that is that if someone walks up to you on the street and says, tell me your qualifications, it's likely that you would wonder, my qualifications as a juggler, as a brain surgeon, what do you need to know? And the same principle applies to your resume. You don't want it to be a list of everything you've ever done, because that's not necessarily highlighting your qualifications for this position. Something to keep in mind is that your resume is answering a question. And if you have been operating with the idea that the question you're answering is, what are all of your skills and experience? You might be finding a cognitive shift happening here. You might be thinking differently about it by the end of this workshop. Because what we would argue is that the question a resume is answering is, what makes you the best fit for this position? And so when you start operating with that question in mind, knowing that that's what you're answering with your resume, that can really make a difference in the responses that you get when you're submitting it. So it's a review of your qualifications for a specific position. One way that you can target a resume is to keep the essential information only. Keep the information, the items that help market you to this employer. And so if it has nothing to do with what they're hiring for, consider, do you need that on your resume in this moment? That doesn't mean that it is never going to be on your resume. It might be very relevant to a different position you apply for later, but is it needed for this one? So I do recommend having kind of a master resume or an everything resume that you keep for yourself. And then you can copy and paste from that onto a new document that you can target. And so that way you're getting the essential information without having to start from zero every time. So essential information only. What information is that? It's information about your skills and accomplishments, especially the ones that will help to market you for this position. What made you good at your job? What will make you good at this job you're applying for? And that is what will make you stand out. That's what will show what makes you unique. You don't want it to just be a laundry list of tasks that were assigned to you that you could just easily copy and paste from a job description, because that says very little about you. What makes you unique, that's where we'll talk later about accomplishment statements and specifying not just this is what I was supposed to do in this job, but this is how well I did this task, and here are the skills I used to do it. Because ultimately, as I said, this is a marketing tool. You are marketing your skills and your experience. So it's about you. You want to keep it focused on your best skills and qualifications that match that job description. As mentioned, an effective resume gets you interviews for positions you're interested in. Some things that can help a resume in general be more effective is that it has kind of a neat and clean appearance. It's focused and targeted to the employer. You've made it a quick and easy read. And we'll talk through some ways to make sure you're doing that. And finally, you want it to be specific. You want it to all be focused, show the employer why are you the best fit for this position. You may notice I'll come back to that a couple times. So let's talk some basics here. Regarding some of these ways to keep your resume readable, keep in mind that your resume is not a complete history. It's a preview. This is a movie trailer. You want to get the employer interested and wanting to know more by interviewing you. And so that's why you want to put the most important information in, leave less relevant information out, or minimize it, depending on how you want to do it. You want it to be a pretty quick and easy read with clear sections, because goodness knows human resources folks and recruiters are busy. And sometimes they have a lot of resumes to go through and very little time to do it. So you want to make sure that if they have just a few seconds to look at your resume, they can really quickly find the most important information. So keep that in mind. And then finally, just remember that your resume is a living document. It's not, I've made it and this is the resume and it's never changing ever again. If it's not getting you the interviews that you want, you have the power to change it and to move things around and see how well they highlight what you want to highlight. So an example of this is one of my favorite slides here. It looks kind of wacky, I'm aware. So let me explain what you're looking at here. This image comes from a study that was done by theladders.com, and they used some fancy software to show the heat from a recruiter's eyeballs as they moved over these two resumes. And so very briefly in the chat, what do you notice about these two resumes? And I know you can't really see the content, but you can see the format. So what do you notice about how they're set up, each of them? And what do you notice about how the recruiter went over them? I'll just give it a second. All right, I see more white space and bullets on the one on the right. Yes. And I see the one on the right has heat signatures all over the page. Yes. Browsing for keywords. Yes, you may notice this is not a big wall of red here. This person is not going to carefully read every single word on the resume. They're jumping around. They're looking for keywords. That's a great thing to notice. The recruiter didn't spend time on the longer paragraph on the left side resume. Yes, down here, there is a whole bunch of text, and you may notice that there is very little red or yellow or even blue here. There's not much here, but they did spend a lot of time looking up here. And that is the top third of the resume. And that's a big deal. A lot of employers, if they don't look at anything else, they'll look at that top third. Great. Well, thank you for playing here and for taking a look at how these are different from each other. And yes, we do notice they didn't even finish this one on the left. The one on the right, it's more covered. And so that can make a big difference how you format that resume. And we'll talk more about that too. So some ways that you can make sure that, or at least hope that the recruiter is going to be looking at your whole resume would be to make it scannable. And this has a double meaning here because some of you may have noticed through your job search that a bunch of employers use software, often called Applicant Tracking Software or ATS, as part of their screening process for their applications. So sometimes your application is going through a computer before it's being seen by a person. But something to keep in mind is that a lot of the things that make something scannable for a person also make it scannable for a computer. So for example, if you're using a really fancy font, that can be harder for us to read quickly. It might take longer for somebody to read through it, and they might not have that time. Similarly, some fancy fonts cannot be read well by applicant tracking software. And so that can also make it look strange or not come out the way you want it to when it goes through that system. Same idea if you have gone wild with your formatting and you have italics and underlines and lines and text boxes and graphics and color. There might be a lot there, but keep in mind that can be very busy for someone to look at. And it also can be challenging for an ATS to process. So keep that in mind. You're going to make it easy for a person to scan, easy for a computer to scan. So you might not know exactly what makes something easy for a computer to scan. And so you can do some research for that. Often when you click through, say, apply now for a position through a company website, the next page it takes you to will not be on their website. It will be through the applicant tracking software. So a lot, like a really popular one is ICIMS. You'll see that across the top, or Workday, or so on. So those are things that you can check out. You can Google that and then see what is recommended for getting through that software well. You may also notice there are a lot of resume templates out there, and those can be really helpful if you are not feeling very confident in formatting your own or just don't want to. But keep it in mind, some of them will note whether they are ATS friendly or whether they can work well with a computer system that an employer would use. Some don't say that. And so when in doubt, keep it simple. That's what I would recommend. And then if you are using a template, it's a good bet if you can find one that will say ATS friendly. So keep that in mind. Some other basics around resumes. The whole reason that you don't want to go too wild with your formatting is so that you won't distract from the content of your resume. And the content's the most important part. Regarding the content, you want to make sure that it is true content. This is a big one. You don't want to put any inaccurate information because that can cost a job later. And just don't even get started with it. You can also focus on skills on things that you've achieved and accomplished, not just the tasks you've performed. Employers are interested in results. They don't just want to know what have you done before. They want to know, well, how well did you do this? How well would you do this type of task if I gave it to you in this role? So keep that in mind. You want to also focus the resume on a particular skill or position. If you try to include all of your experience and skills, that makes it harder for the employer to kind of see you in the position that they are hiring for. So again, focus, focus, focus. It all comes back to focusing in. So other things to keep in mind, if you are getting feedback from your resume that you are overqualified for the positions you're interested in, then that is where you would want to look at that resume again and see how you can focus it further. And so if this can be challenging for folks because we take pride in the work we've done, we take pride in the accomplishments we've had. And so if you are concerned about that and feel like, well, I don't want to dumb down my resume, keep in mind that that's not what you're doing. If you were answering the question, what's all the experience and skills you have before, it would feel like that, yes. But your resume is answering the question, how well do you match this position? And so if you're putting additional information that is not relevant, then it is not as targeted as it could be. And so that is what might be resulting in the feedback about being overqualified. So that's something to keep in mind. We'll get through this slide and then we'll pause briefly for questions. So it's regarding resume basics for formatting. We will get through this and then the next section will be kind of focusing on a few specific formats that can work well for different situations. So after doing that, my hope is that you will feel more confident in choosing a format that best fits your individual situation. As I mentioned earlier, the top 1/3 of a given page is the most important part of the resume. If the employer looks at one part of the resume and not any other part, it's very likely going to be in that top 1/3 of the first page. So that's where you want to put your important information. That's where you want to put your intention, which could be a professional title, your objective, your summary statement. There are many different things it could be. A lot of them are rather similar to each other, and we'll talk through what those can look like. But ultimately, you want to grab the employer's attention right away. And remember to be friends with white space on your resume. That doesn't mean you want a great big gap in the middle, but if you have a resume that is just margin to margin, a wall of text, you would likely get a response like you saw on the page with the heat sensor from the recruiter, where they stopped reading once it was a big wall of text. Very similar to that ending small print on the applications, walls of text tend to shout to us, I am very boring, please skip me. So utilize bullet points, be aware of your margins. If they're too wide, kind of like that first resume that you saw, they can kind of look like a column of text, and that can make it harder to read. If they're too narrow, then sometimes the ends can be cut off when they go through an applicant tracking system. So try to keep it between kind of a 1/2 inch and an inch with your margins. You want your text to be readable. So definitely no smaller than size 10, ideally no less than size 12. You don't want the one thing a recruiter remembers about your resume to be the headache that they got trying to read it. So make sure that it's pretty easy to read. Also, it was quite common up till rather recently to include at the bottom of a resume, references are available upon request. That was expected for a very long time. These days, the tide has gone out for that right now. There's not really that expectation currently for listing your references. So I would not recommend including that on the resume. And so regarding references, if they are not requested right away, you don't need to send them right away. They will be requested later on, depending on how that employer's process works. But if references are requested right away, then I would recommend putting them on a separate sheet of paper, and you want that to have the same name and contact information block as you have on your resume and your cover letter. If you happen to attend last week, then you would have gotten a little bit more about that. It's called branding. And the very short version of what that means is that you want those documents to all have the same format at the top with your contact information block. You want them to all look like they belong to the same person. They're all going to the same party. So make sure that you do that with any documents you'll be sending for a given position. All right, before we move on, any questions that have not already been addressed either in the chat or through what we've discussed so far?
Yes, we do have a few, Vanessa.
Okay.
First of all, a lot of questions about being overqualified.
Okay.
But let's start with this one. What fonts are recommended for resumes?
Quite simple standard fonts. I mean, I've seen some that would say Times New Roman or Helvetica. Some people like Cambria. Some people like Gill Sans. General thing to keep in mind is that our eyes tend to like the sans serif style fonts more than they like with the serif. So the ones that don't have little thingies on the ends of the S or of the letters. I don't know if I'm describing that well, but you'll notice that here, this is a sans serif font. They don't have any little lines on the ends. And so that can be a good direction to go. You just don't want it to be anything that will distract from your content.
And what about font size? What do you recommend there?
I would say definitely no smaller than 10, ideally no smaller than 12.
Okay. And are you aware of any websites that provide an ATS friendly resume template?
Some of the there are actually excuse me, there are actually some templates through Google Docs that are listed as ATS friendly. And so that can be one way to go about it. You can also get an idea of how well your resume might play with an ATS by using the website jobscan.co. Maybe Sheila, maybe you can put that in the chat. But that has a place where you can put in your resume. They have some great articles about ATS, and you can enter it and see how well it would be listed as matching a given job description. So that can be a helpful tool for your toolbox as well.
Okay, and then here's an overqualified question. So,
Mhm.
so what if you're not hung up on a job title and the overall opportunity, but you most, but your most recent experience includes a job title that may cause people to assume you're overqualified. For example, you were a director, but your job search includes looking at manager level opportunities.
Hmm. Well, one way that you could address that could be in the choice of format for your resume. So we'll talk about that in just a second here, and I hope that might help to address or at least give you some ideas for it.
Okay, and I think you're going to talk about this coming up, so we'll hold off on these questions.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your engagement. So we will keep rolling. We'll answer as many questions as we can. So let's talk more about formats more specifically. So resumes can be formatted in a number of different ways, and we're going to zoom in on three kind of common ones. So we'll be looking at a chronological resume, a functional or skills-based resume, and a combination of the two. And we'll talk through who might be the best type of job seeker or who would be in a situation in which this resume type versus that resume type might be effective. So to start with, this is a chronological resume, and a chronological resume is possibly what most people think of when they think about a resume. It's a very traditional style. And so what you can see, I'll be bringing out my laser pointer again, is that we have the contact information at the top, a summary and skills in that top third of the resume, and then employment history, starting with the most recent position, and then the one before that. And if there were another, it'd be the one before that, and then education. And so the strength of a chronological resume is that it highlights your recent employment. It's a really good option if you have had pretty consistent employment history. You've been in this field for a while, you want to continue in this field, and the different positions you've had most recently all kind of tell this story. So for example, Robert here introduces himself in the summary as a production assembler and has some great details about his accomplishments there. Selected skills and expertise, most of them have to do with production assembly. His most recent position, job title, was production assembler. Before that, circuit board assembler, which is a form of production assembly. And then his education is also related to production assembly. Every section of this resume is singing the same song about production assembly. So we can hazard a guess that he's going to apply for a position in a similar field and that he's going to have a very strong case for himself. And so that is when this can be a really helpful format for a resume. Uh, as far as how far back you want to go, ideally, you want to put, at least in detail, your last 10 to 15 years of work history and or your last three positions, depending on what's relevant to the position that you're applying for. So if you have experience that's relevant that's older than that, then there are some different ways you can format it to put less emphasis on it, but still honor it on the resume. And I'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about additional sections. So that was a chronological resume. You may now be wondering, well, what if I'm really early in my career and I don't have a lot of work experience yet? How do I how do I make a case for myself for a position when I haven't worked a lot? That is where a functional resume or skills-based resume might come in. So this is just an example. We don't have a character. But here's how this works. At the top, once again, we have contact information. We have a type of intention stating an objective, or here's the job title that I'm interested in, and a summary of qualifications. But then here's where we branch off. Instead of going to here's the most recent position I've had, we go into here are my accomplishments in different categories. And so this could work well if you have experience and skills, but haven't always gotten those experiences or built those skills in traditional employment settings. So here, for example, if the position someone's applying for is they really highlight customer service, you could make this first skill set category customer service and then state here are the different skills I have, the accomplishments I've done related to customer service. The beauty of this type of format is that it's very customizable. So you can make that job description your best friend, take a look at it, see what it highlights and what matches the skills you have. And then you can change what your skill sets categories that you're highlighting based on what is in that job description. So if they are really focused on a certain type of technology and you have experience in that, you can make that one of your skill sets. So the nice thing about this is that none of these bullet points are tied to a specific work experience. And so some of it could have been built while you were volunteering or while you were in an extracurricular activity or while you were doing something that other than a traditional work experience. And so then at the bottom here, rather than saying, here's my work history, you would say education, training, personal development. And so there's a little bit more freedom there to highlight the different places where you would have built your skills. So this can work really well for folks who are at the beginning of their career and are wanting to highlight the skills they have, even if it wasn't all built in a traditional employment experience. But you may be wondering, if I don't have kind of a consistent work history that leads up to a certain field, if I'm looking to change fields and I'm not at the beginning of my career, I have plenty of experience behind me, what works well for me? The answer might be a combination resume. And so a combination resume does exactly what it sounds like it does. It brings together some elements of both a chronological resume and a functional one. So let's see what we mean here. Susan here says in her summary statement that she is an experienced security professional. Great. That is our introduction. We can assume she's probably applying for a security related position. She goes from there into selected skills and experience, just like the functional resume. So the categories that she has chosen, likely from looking at a job description, are building and personnel security, emergency management and prevention, leadership, and customer service. All types of skills that are very important in a security profession. And she highlights some great accomplishments and tasks that she has done. So that's wonderful. These top 2/3 of the resume, she makes a very strong case for herself as a security professional. And then down here, because she does have employment history, we have employment history listed. And so that's where you can put the job title, the employer, and the dates when you worked somewhere. And what you will notice that we're going in reverse chronological order again, the most recent first and moving back. The one thing that is not here is a security officer position or any kind of security related job title. And that's where this format really does the work. Because if she had opened with, these are the most recent positions I've had, then the first thing the employer sees is, well, that doesn't match the position I'm hiring for. And so they don't make the connection right away of why are you applying for this position? By putting these skills and these types of expertise first, the first thing the employer sees is this very strong case she's making for herself to say, yes, I do have the skills for this position. And then it's not until we're down here and his eyes are already dazzling by all of these great skills that Susan is highlighting that we see, oh, well, she hasn't worked in this exact position before, but I mean, look what she can do. So that's where it really helps to be deliberate about your format because it affects where you're putting the spotlight on your skills and experience. So those are three basic types of resume format. There are all kinds of ways to be creative with it, but those are some good places to start for different situations. So briefly in the chat, I want you to think back. I'm testing your memory a little bit. What sections were present on all three versions of those resumes that I showed you? Were there any sections that you noticed were there every time? Contact info, yes. Education, skills, summary, yes. You guys are doing great. All right, yes, we see lots of summaries and objectives and skills and accomplishments. Beautiful. You are all very observant and have very good memory for the morning. I appreciate you all very much. So yes, we're going to talk about some basic parts of the resume. And there was some version of these parts on each one. So we'll start from the top, very straightforward. Let's talk about contact information. there are some good tips to keep in mind with contact information. For one, ideally use your full name rather than a nickname. If you are in a particular situation where that gets more complicated, I'd encourage you to talk with somebody through your career force office one-on-one about what would work best for you. Uh, for a long time, it was quite common for people to put their entire address on a resume. These days, it is not as common. It's not expected as much. If you put your city and state, you'd be just fine. One reason that sometimes folks don't want to put it on their resume is that it could be a security concern. If, say, someone is holding all the resumes they printed out and they comically run into somebody and the wind blows it away and somebody else picks it up, they now have your entire address and phone number and email address. Will the employer still want this information? Yes, they will likely ask for it in the application, but since that is being delivered directly to them securely, then that is a little bit of a different situation. So it is up to you if you want to include your full address on the resume, but it's not required to put the entire thing. Other things to keep in mind, if you have more than one phone number that you use, we encourage you to pick one and let that be the one that you're going to use. That can make it simpler for the employer, and make sure that it's a number that you're going to be able to answer most of the time. If it's a cell phone, a home phone, what have you, you don't need to put cell or home next to it. They'll be able to assume. And so that way you just are decluttering as much as you can. You want to keep it as visually straightforward and simple as possible. I also have a rhetorical question for everybody, so you don't need to answer it, but do think about it. When is the last time you listened to your voicemail recording? If your question or your answer to that is that might be something that I'd recommend trying at some point here pretty soon, because you want to make sure that your voicemail recording is up to date and representing you the way that you want to represent yourself to prospective employers. And so goodness knows I have heard some things on people's voicemails over the years. There have been songs that have lasted the entire several minutes of the recording. There have been smart remarks. There have been the job seeker themselves singing a little song, which it was very whimsical and lovely, but maybe a little distracting for an employer and very long. And we have also heard just being jostled around in somebody's bag for the entire duration of the recording and wondering the entire time, did they accidentally answer? Is this what happened? And so you don't want to distract the employer with that. That cannot be a great first impression. It might be the second impression. Still, be careful with it. So make sure that that's up to date. Same idea with the email address. You want to keep it professional, some version of your name. If you are very attached to your groovygirl2005@gmail.com email address, I'm not saying to get rid of it, but I would recommend maybe making a separate one just for your job search activities. And so that can be helpful twofold. For one, then you've got just a straightforward professional email address that you can use for employers. And that means that you might not lose some of the communications regarding an application or a job if your inbox of your personal email address looks like mine. So that can be a great way to make sure that you're separating those out. And finally, if you have a LinkedIn profile and it's active and up to date, I would encourage you to include a link to it there. All right, next up would be your intention, which can look like a few different things. It could look like an objective, it can look like a job title or highlight kind of headline. It can look like a summary. And so ultimately, you want that to be specific to the position you're applying for. If you are not able to target any other part of your resume, target that summary. Because if the employer doesn't look at any other part of it, they will be looking at that. So keep that in mind. You want to keep it not just a focus on I want, but also on I bring. So you don't want to say just I'm seeking a challenging position with a growing company, period, nothing else. Yeah, that's a perfectly appropriate thing to seek, but it doesn't say much about what you're bringing to the table. And so something else that could be helpful would be to say, seeking a position that would benefit from strong skills in A, B, and C. Or, like you can see up here, creative and motivated engineer with more than 10 years of experience in something related to the position. And so that can be a way to make sure that your summary is doing some heavy lifting and making sure that employer knows that If they keep reading this resume, they will see good reasons to hire you. So that is something to keep in mind with objectives and summaries. 4, your professional experience. This looked a little different between the different formats, but it had a similar role. So for a chronological resume, that can look like your job title, the company, when you worked there, where you were, and then some accomplishment statements about what you did in that role. And so that is where you want to keep in mind that you want to put your most relevant skills first. Ideally, I would recommend no more than 6 bullet points under each of these, even if you did a lot. Try to keep it to the 6 most relevant bullet points or fewer for that position that are most relevant to the position you're applying for. And that way you're keeping everything focused. Again, go back maybe 10 to 15 years. If you have more experience beyond that, then you can have a separate section called additional relevant experience. And that's where you can put a short summary, just a couple sentences of your collective experience that is older than 10 to 15 years. And I would encourage you to connect with your Career Force office to talk through how to do that if that's something you're interested in. Similarly, for a skills-based resume or a combination resume, target, target, target. There's a little more work, I would say, in targeting a skills-based or combination resume than it would be for chronological, simply because you have a lot more freedom to play with what categories you're using. So if this person's applying for an engineering position, yes, engineering qualifications make a lot of sense to include. And so again, this is going into not just this is what was assigned to me, but this is what I did. And then finally, education is the last kind of core section. And so some things to know about listing education. If you have any college level education at all, even if you didn't finish, even if it was for 1 month, you don't need to list your high school. The reason for that is that employers can assume that you have completed high school or equivalent in order to qualify to enroll for a college program. So if you're listing college, then you don't need to list high school. Also, dates are optional for education. That's a little different than the work history, where we would encourage you to include dates. Um, Generally, and for education, likely they'll ask for that on the application. And so you will be submitting that information. But again, the application is a screening tool, the resume is a marketing tool. And so education dates can suggest age or how current your academic knowledge is. And that might not matter because you might have been working in the field since then and have very up to date skills, but you don't want to mislead the employer to think that the last time you used this skill was in this year that was a while back. You don't want them to make any assumptions like that. So you can leave them off. If unless you really want to keep them on, you certainly can, but it's an optional thing. Similarly to the work history section, you would also want to list your most recent education first. I've seen a number of people who will, or rather of resumes, who will have their work history going from newest to oldest, and then their education from oldest to newest. And I'm not sure why, but I would recommend being consistent. And so starting with the newest. So the first thing the employer reads is what is most current and most relevant. All right, and finally, some other resume sections that you might be able to include are well beyond those core 4. And so these, I would recommend including them if they are relevant. And I've used the word relevant a lot because that is very important for resumes. So if you have volunteer experience that is related to the type of work you want to do, sure, it's completely appropriate to include that. Just make sure you're noting that it was volunteer. And so any one of these that you feel will help to strengthen your case for a given position can be included in the resume. Some things to keep in mind, though, is to be cautious of including affiliations that could be polarizing. You can build some wonderful experience volunteering as part of a political campaign or volunteering with your faith community, and that can really be helpful in especially if you are applying for example, a position with an organization that's also affiliated with that same faith community or with that same political party. Just keep in mind, it's up to you if you want to include it or not. Just know that that can be polarizing and you don't know who will be looking at your resume each step of the way. So that is entirely up to you. Before moving on to the last kind of home stretch here, any additional questions in the chat, Sheila, that aren't already addressed?
I think you answered quite a few of them.
Okay.
I was just responding to one, someone was asking if you can list education that's not specific training, like you didn't get a degree. Um, your thoughts
Absolutely.
on that? Yeah.
Yes. You can put, I mean, for example, especially if the focus or the coursework is related to the work you want to do, you can put, I don't know, engineering coursework, or even if you didn't get to that point, if you were working on your general education and didn't complete it, you can say general education coursework. And that's completely fine to include. That still shows that you have received college level education and that you have built some expertise there. So I would say certainly include it.
Yeah. And then I see this happen often. So someone's saying that generally when you apply for jobs online, they they parse the resume and it usually follows a chronological format, especially if it's
Hmm.
putting into the application.
Yes.
So do you think in that case it's better to use the chronological format, even though the combination might highlight your skills better?
Well, what I've found often with applications like that, where many will let you parse the resume and they believe that will just help it make it easier for you, and mileage may vary with that, but I often there's a spot where you can parse your resume and automatically fill in part of the application. And then there's a spot later for attachments. And you can, a lot of times I've seen where you can mark if you want to use the resume that you used to parse or if you want to upload a different one. And so sometimes there will be that option. If you are not sure, it doesn't hurt to have a chronological version of your resume, similar to what I had talked about having kind of an everything resume on hand that you mostly use for yourself. You can kind of curate that to be a helpful one that you can use when you're parsing it just to save some time. And then ideally, if you have the opportunity later on to upload a separate resume for that, then you can put your combination or skills-based resume in there. So that'd be my thought on it.
Okay. And then you answered the question about how many bullet points. You said about 6 is ideal.
Six
Um,
maximum. I think I would say 3 to 6, depending on how long you were at the position and what's
okay.
relevant.
Okay. And then you did mention 10 to 15 years of experience when you're listing your employment. So that question was answered as well.
Okay.
We'll do one more. Should one include a section of licenses held even if they don't directly apply to the position?
I think that if they don't apply to the position, then my question would be, what is the purpose of including them on the resume for that particular position? If you do have licenses and certifications, make sure, and if they are relevant to the position, make sure they also are valid and not expired. Generally, I would not recommend putting anything expired on a resume because then that doesn't provide a value add to the employer in that moment. And then if you have built skills or expertise in gaining that certification or that license, you would be able to highlight that with the job description, the work history entry for where you use those skills or elsewhere on the resume. So that would be my thought on it. Um, Again, ultimately, it's your document, and so if you feel that this helps to represent you professionally and show the breadth of what you have done and what you know how to do, okay, that works fine. But I would, in general, recommend keeping it relevant wherever you can. All right. And I do see one more in the chat briefly that I can answer quickly. Should dates be included with training and certificates? I would recommend that for training and certificates. You don't necessarily need it for formal education, but for the training and the certificates, especially if they expire, that's how you can show that they are current and valid. All right, so in the last few minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about accomplishment statements. And so I've used that term a couple of times, and this is what you see on your screen is kind of the formula for an accomplishment statement. And this is what you can use in your bullet points rather than just saying, this is what was assigned to me, focusing more on this is what I achieved in this position, or this is how I used this skill and had a good outcome. So that is something that you can start to play around with and how you're talking about it. And I'll show you an example in a little bit here. But when you are completing your bullet points for your resume, something I'd recommend avoiding are phrases like responsibilities included or responsible for. That doesn't necessarily add a lot of value to the resume and doesn't say much about what you did and how well you did it. Also, I can imagine that many of us have met someone at some point in life that was responsible for something and didn't necessarily do a very good job at it. So, what I would recommend, instead of responsible for managing inventory and blah, 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 you can say managed inventory, blah, blah, blah. So, just cut that out entirely if you can. So, regarding accomplishment statements, an example of what you can do with an accomplishment statement would be changing something from entered data on computer system to um, entered accurate data or entered data with a 100% accuracy rate and contributing to reports of A, B, and C. That's a way to bring a little bit more detail about what you did. And so what I will have you try out, and I know that you haven't gotten a lot of examples on this, but I would like you to try it out anyway. I'm going to give you a couple of very short task statements, and I would encourage you to try out using your imagination and coming up with what could turn that into an accomplishment statement. What could this look like if someone is saying more about what they did in this role? So I will go ahead and send it, or not send it, but I will go to this slide. I would encourage you to pull up either a little word processing document or grab a pencil and paper, and I'll give you a couple minutes just to give this a try. So here these two are, kept inventory and called customers. So what could build on this to say more about somebody who did well in that type of task? So I'll give you a couple minutes and I will talk at you while you're doing it. So some things to keep in mind with accomplishment statements is that rather than just saying, this is what I was responsible for, this is what I was supposed to do as someone with this job title, you can be specific, you can add some numbers, you can quantify. So some ways that you can expand on these would be to thinking, who was I collaborating with doing this task? What was the focus? What was the purpose? When was I doing this? Was this during a time of transition? Was this during a time when we were learning a new software? Where and what kind of environment was I doing this? Why? What was the purpose of it? So those journalist questions can be really helpful. How often did I do this task? What kind of situation did I demonstrate this skill in? Why was it me? How often or how well did I do this? Um, what kind of work was it? What kind of project was it? What types of system or software or equipment or tool did you use? And so those are some things that you can keep in mind as you're expanding some of these. Do we have any brave souls to try putting in the chat one or both of these, an expanded version that you've tried out? This is a zero judgment zone.
Someone indicated to give best practices and stats, so they're quantifying. That's good.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and I see managed inventory of 10,000 SKUs. Boom. That immediately gives more information and about the scale at which you did that work. Accurately managed inventory by assuring products were reachable. Yes, that's not just saying I did this, but this is how I did it successfully. Communicated directly with customers via telephone. Yes, this is how you communicated. You're showing communication skills. This is the equipment you used. Called customers responded to queries 100% within time standard target, improving customer service ratings by a certain percentage. Yes, that is beautiful. So this, oh my gosh, you are into it. I'm so happy. This is great. You guys are doing a really good job. Yes, and they can look all kinds of ways. These are some examples here, but I can use one of yours as an example here. Provided monthly performance calls with customers to ensure 100% client satisfaction rate. That gives so much more information than called customers while using not that many more words. Kept accurate inventory on a monthly basis and connected personally with 30 key customers per week over a 2-year period. How much information does that give? It says, this is how often I did this, and so I did it regularly. It says, this is how I connected with customers. This is how many, so this is how busy of a workload I was able to handle. And here's how long I did this. Wonderful. So thank you all for submitting these. You know what you're doing. You're doing great. So we are getting toward the end here. As mentioned, I said that we would talk about cover letters briefly. And something that I would recommend is it's good to have a cover letter on deck. Not every employer is going to ask for one. That's just how things are right now. Some will, and then some will make it an option to include one, but not required. Best practice that we recommend is if there is an opportunity to provide a cover letter, provide a cover letter. And so what we would recommend is just to make sure that that cover letter has to be targeted. You don't want it to be just kind of a blank form letter to an employer. They'll be able to tell. So it's a chance to show off your writing skills. It's a chance to be a little bit more personal because then you have the opportunity to talk about why this position? Why are you interested in this company? And so that's where you can expand on it because you don't want it to just be a paragraph version of your resume. So here are a few tips on the screen for cover letters and what makes a strong one. You don't want them to be super long. You don't want it to be a great big essay. It's just like the resume, you want it to be pretty easy to read, even if it is paragraphs. So ideally, if you can keep it to 3 paragraphs total, that's great. Ideally, you don't want it to be more than a page. And so you also want to make sure you are indicating how you will follow up with the employer whenever possible. And so that can be clear. So if you do plan to follow up yourself, say how you're going to do it and then make sure you do it. Also, proofread, edit, no mistakes. And that's something that we can help you out with at Career Force too. We're happy to proofread and go over cover letters and resumes and any other job search documents with you. So I know that was a very quick dipping of the toe into cover letters, but if you are curious about them or if you have a draft and you want to have someone look it over, please go ahead and contact your closest Career Force office. We're happy to do that. All right. And as mentioned, we also do resume review. And so I believe many, if not all, of the offices are able to do that in person, virtually, over the phone. As long as we can both see your resume, it's fair game. And so we are happy to do that. Goodness knows when you are applying to a lot of positions and looking at your resume all the time, then it can stop looking like words after a while. So that's what we're here for. If you need another set of eyes on the resume, we are happy to help. So please do reach out to us, and that can be a great next step, especially if anything from this workshop has inspired you or has gotten the gears turning. So we are at 11:01. Thank you for giving me the grace of 1 extra minute to make sure we cover everything. And I know we went through this quick and that there may be more questions, but I hope you'll reach out to your nearest office and we would love to answer your questions and to help. So thank you again for joining us today and have a wonderful day. You will be receiving a follow-up email by the end of the day tomorrow, as Sheila mentioned, with this recording, the slides and speaker notes, and some additional supplemental material. Have a wonderful day.